On September 25th, 2025, the marble halls of the United Nations in New York carried the weight of routine. It was the 80th annual session of the General Assembly, another year of speeches, resolutions, and polite applause. But behind the ceremony, a storm was quietly building. A young president from a small landlocked nation had been summoned not to speak, but to submit. The world expected Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso to read a 12-page confession written in Paris, polished in Washington, and stamped in Tel Aviv. A script of humiliation meant to break him before the eyes of hundreds of leaders and millions watching around the globe. The hall was silent, tense, waiting. Would this young African soldier president bend his knee? Would history record him as a fleeting rebel, silenced by power, or as the spark of something greater? Even the delegates felt the air tighten. Cameras were ready. Pens hovered above notepads. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then Traoré opened the file. He looked at the words designed to crush his dignity, and he closed it. Slowly, deliberately, he folded the confession and placed it aside. In that gesture, history shifted. What had been meant as a script of surrender became, in his hands, a weapon of indictment. His voice rose, not trembling, not pleading, but steady, sharp, and unrelenting. He did not confess Africa's guilt. He charged the world with its crimes. The first crime, he thundered, was the transatlantic slave trade. 12 million souls shackled, shipped, and broken so that empires of sugar, cotton, and coffee could rise on blood. The second crime, the CFA franc, financial slavery that chained 14 nations to the French treasury, stealing more than $500 billion. Then Rwanda, 1994, 800,000 lives lost in 100 days while France shielded the killers. IMF debt traps, ripping health and education from the hands of children. Ghanaian farmers bankrupted while Nestle and Cargill grew fat on cocoa. The assassinations of Lumumba and Sankara. Cold War dictatorships funded with guns instead of bread. Nigeria's poisoned rivers from oil plunder. Foreign bases across the continent, each one a chain of sovereignty. And finally, the manipulation of human rights. Principles turned into weapons, applied only when it served Western interest. Every word fell like a hammer. The hall did not applaud. It did not whisper. It froze in silence, because silence was the only admission left. And then Traoré sharpened his attack. He named Emmanuel Macron, not just a president, but the heir of empire. He called out Donald Trump, trading oil for blood. He accused the IMF of building cages and calling them reforms. The room shifted uneasily. Some delegates lowered their eyes, others scribbled nervously. But no one could deny the truth cutting through the marble air. This was not the speech of a man begging for pity. This was the roar of a continent demanding justice. And in that instant, the question was no longer whether Ibrahim Traoré would surrender. The question became, would the world dare to listen? The first crime, the slave trade. He began with the wound that never healed. Over 12 million Africans torn from their homes, chained and shipped across oceans. He thundered, the empires of Europe were not built on progress. They were built on our blood. The second crime, the CFA franc 14 nations shackled by a colonial currency, forced to keep half their reserves in Paris. More than $500 billion stolen in broad daylight. Traoré asked, is this freedom or just another kind of chain? The third crime, Rwanda, 1994. 800,000 dead in 100 days. And while machetes dripped with blood, France sheltered the killers. Silence filled the hall as he said, genocide was not an African madness, it was a crime abetted by foreign hands. The fourth crime, the IMF traps structural adjustment, they called it. A polite name for strangulation. In Zambia, 40% of the health budget vanished, not from disease but from debt. Children died, not because medicine failed, but because medicine was priced out of reach. The fifth crime, the death of African agriculture cocoa farmers in Ghana bankrupt, while Nestle and Cargill reaped billions. Markets liberalized, but only for the powerful. When our farmers fall, Traoré said. Their corporations rise. The sixth crime, assassination of leaders. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. Both silenced, both murdered. Their crime? Daring to speak of dignity. They buried our leaders, he declared, but their voices still rise through us. The seventh crime, Cold War interference. Washington armed Mobutu Sese Seko, while millions of Zairians starved. Guns instead of bread, dictators instead of democracy. Africa became a chessboard where our lives were pawns. The eighth crime, Nigeria's oil ExxonMobil and Total drained black gold from Nigerian soil, leaving rivers poisoned, fields toxic, and 30 million people trapped in misery. Life expectancy barely touched 50. They took the wealth, he said, and left the death. The ninth crime, foreign military bases. The U.S. Africa Command with 29 installations. France still clinging to Djibouti. They call it stability, but every base is another chain fastened to Africa's sovereignty. The 10th crime, weaponized human rights. Zimbabwe condemned, Sudan punished, Mali isolated, yet Chad and Gabon escape criticism because they serve Western interest. For them, human rights are not principles, Traoré thundered. They are weapons. And then the silence grew heavier. 10 crimes had been spoken, yet the young president did not stop. He turned his gaze toward living names, living powers, the architects of chains still clamped on Africa. Emmanuel Macron, Traoré declared, his voice cutting through marble walls. You are not simply a president. You are the heir to an empire of colonizers. The same chains that dragged Africans across oceans still feed your republic today. A ripple of shock tore through the French delegation. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. Their pens scratched nervously across paper, but not one dared to answer. Then his voice struck deeper. Donald Trump, he thundered, you turned oil and trade into bargaining chips bought with the blood of nations. You claim greatness for your country, but it is greatness carved out of our suffering. The American diplomats stiffened. Some faces froze in icy discipline. Others betrayed flickers of discomfort. The sting of the accusation could not be disguised. But Traoré was not finished. He turned toward the unseen power, the shadow in tailored suits. Directors of the International Monetary Fund, he said, his voice unwavering. You wear the mask of development, but you are wardens of a financial prison. You strip our budgets, bind our governments, and call it reform. Yet what you truly build are cages. The hall stirred uneasily. Western delegations exchanged glances, eyes darting away from the podium. For decades, speeches here were laced with caution, dipped in diplomacy. But in this moment, there was no veil, no filter, only indictment. The chamber was no longer a form of diplomacy. It had become a courtroom. And the West now stood not as judge, but as the accused. When the last accusation struck the hall, a silence heavier than iron settled over the assembly. The great powers shifted in their seats, the weight of centuries suddenly pressing down upon them. And yet, Ibrahim Traoré did not waver. His voice, sharpened by history, now carried not only anger but a pledge, a declaration that turned the United Nations chamber into something far greater than a stage. He leaned forward, his words deliberate, each syllable landing like a drumbeat. We are not here to beg. We are not here to curse. We ask for no pity. We demand justice. In that instant, the mask of diplomacy shattered. The hall that had been built for polite speeches now became a witness stand, where the oppressed stood tall and the powerful stood accused. He invoked a name that still burned in the hearts of his people, Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary of Burkina Faso, silenced in 1987. They tried to bury his voice, Traoré declared, but the flame of Sankara was not extinguished. It burns in us, in every African who refuses to kneel. The mention of Sankara sent a ripple across African delegations. Quiet nods, subtle smiles, the pride of a shared memory rising once more. Then he cast his words not only to Africa, but to the entire world. We want an Africa that decides for itself, free from debt traps, free from foreign bases, free from the theft of our soil and our spirit. We want an Africa united, not fractured, sovereign, not dictated to, a continent that no longer carries chains disguised as aid. His voice carried a rhythm, almost like scripture, echoing across marble walls. For a moment, the assembly no longer resembled a chamber of politicians. It felt like a gathering of witnesses, summoned to hear a testimony of centuries. If the world desires peace, Traoré continued, then restore justice to Africa. If the world seeks fairness, then lift the chains of debt. Without Africa's dignity, there can be no global balance. He painted a vision, bold and unflinching, a union of black gold, not merely oil and minerals, but the living wealth of Africa's people, a continent ready to renegotiate its place in the world, not as pawns, not as subjects, but as equals. His words carried the cadence of prophecy, the weight of something larger than one man or one nation. The hall was frozen between awe and unease. Some delegates sat taller, emboldened. Others shrank, indicted. For decades, African leaders had been told to speak with caution, to temper their words, to frame their truth in the language of diplomacy. But Traoré shattered that mold. He spoke not for approval, not for applause, but for freedom. And in that defiance, he offered more than a speech. He offered a mirror to the world, a reflection of what it had done and what it could no longer deny. When Traoré's final words echoed into silence, the United Nations chose its shield: omission. Official transcripts omitted his speech, citing procedural irregularities. The chamber that had just trembled with truth tried to cover itself in bureaucracy, but the world outside could not be muted. Within hours, the full text leaked online. Screens lit up across continents. The speech the UN tried to bury was resurrected by the people. In Nairobi, young activists gathered in cafes, playing clips of the speech on their phones, their voices rising with every line. We ask for no pity, we demand justice. In Lagos, crowds in marketplaces paused mid-transaction, staring at shaky live streams on cracked screens. In Johannesburg, murals appeared overnight. Traoré's face painted with fire in his eyes, the words "Union of Black Gold" scrawled beneath. The diaspora responded with the same fire. In Paris, young Africans marched with placards declaring, "Traoré speaks for us." In London, students draped in Pan-African flags occupied city squares. In New York and Washington, African-American leaders invoked his words in sermons and rallies, drawing sharp parallels between Africa's struggle and the unfinished battles of civil rights. Churches in Atlanta and Detroit spoke his lines as scripture. Without Africa's dignity, there can be no global balance. Yet the reaction was not only emotional, it was political. Policy circles in Europe whispered of a dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation, could stand in defiance at the UN, what would stop Nigeria, South Africa, or even allies in the Caribbean from following? One defiant speech, they feared, could ripple into a chorus that threatened centuries of economic control. In Washington, the unease was immediate. Analysts at think tanks warned that the speech could fracture America's carefully constructed influence across Africa. Congressional aides worried aloud. He named a U.S. president at the UN. What happens when others dare the same? Cable news channels debated endlessly. Was Ibrahim Traoré reckless, or was he reshaping the moral conversation of our time? For the establishment, the fear was not the man, but the mirror he held up. In Europe, silence was the chosen defense. French diplomats avoided eye contact in corridors. British ministers sidestepped questions. German officials muttered about populism. But outside their offices, in immigrant neighborhoods of Paris and Berlin, the speech played on repeat, a rallying cry for communities long treated as invisible. Asia and Latin America felt the tremors too. In Caracas and Havana, commentators praised Traoré as the African Chavez. In Sao Paulo, youth movements quoted his denunciation of IMF financial prisons. In India and Vietnam, editorials noted that the speech marked a tectonic shift, a voice from Africa joining the global call for multipolarity. And still, in Africa itself, the reaction was volcanic. Leaders who had once spoken cautiously now faced pressure from their own citizens. Why don't you speak like Traoré? The hashtag Wash Union of Black Gold surged across platforms. More than a slogan, it became a demand. a demand for sovereignty, a demand for dignity. Western media struggled to frame the story. Some called it theatrical defiance. Others admitted reluctantly that the historical charges could not be dismissed. Editorial boards weighed every word, careful not to validate, but unable to ignore. The image of Traoré clutching the folded confession, transformed into an indictment, ran across front pages. Commentators compared it to Mandela's raised fist, to Nkrumah's Declaration of Independence. The West had set the stage for humiliation. Instead, it birthed a symbol. A speech meant to be silenced became the loudest echo in decades. The silence of the hall was mirrored by the noise of the world, and in that noise, the balance of power trembled. For the first time in years, the question was not about aid packages or military interventions. It was about dignity. Could the world afford to ignore the cry of a continent rising? Or had Ibrahim Traoré lit a flame too bright to be extinguished? The cameras caught it, though no one planned for it. Ibrahim Traoré leaving the marble halls of the United Nations, not with bowed shoulders, not with the defeated air of a man forced to confess, but with a file clutched firmly under his arm. Inside that file was not the scripted confession of weakness, but the indictment he had thundered to the world. 10 crimes named and numbered, sealed not in ink, but in defiance. That single image traveled faster than any speech. On front pages from Johannesburg to São Paulo, from Lagos to Paris, the photo appeared. A young African leader walking with unshaken posture, eyes steady, the so-called confession now transformed into evidence against centuries of oppression. Commentators began to compare it to other historic moments. Mandela raising a fist from his prison cell, Kwame Nkrumah declaring independence in Accra, even Sankara himself smiling defiantly in fatigues as he told the world that Africa's destiny would be written by Africans. Within days, murals appeared in Dakar, Accra, and Bamako. In them, Traoré was painted larger than life, his silhouette carrying the file branded with the words, "Western Crimes." Graffiti artists scrawled beneath it, not a confession, a case file. Street musicians turned his words into song. School children repeated the line that had become immortal. We did not ask permission to be free, we stood up to claim it. What startled the West was not only the reach of the image, but the speed of its transformation into myth. The confession meant to humiliate him vanished from memory. The indictment became scripture. Hashtags surged worldwide. Traoré speaks, Union of Black Gold, Africa rises. Social media in Africa erupted in pride, while diasporas in Europe and America reposted the image as if it were a family portrait, proof that the silenced could still roar. But symbolism has power beyond poetry. In policy rooms across Washington, Brussels, and Paris, the mood was darker. Officials whispered, "He has turned weakness into strength. He has created a symbol that cannot be contained." For centuries, Africa had been portrayed as fractured, voiceless, dependent. Now a single image threatened that narrative, uniting millions under a banner not designed in foreign capitals, but born in defiance on a global stage. In Africa itself, the consequences were immediate. Newspapers declared that Burkina Faso has put the world on trial. Opposition parties, once critical of Traoré, found themselves echoing his words in parliament. Religious leaders quoted his speech in sermons. Even school teachers told their students, "This is the day Africa spoke without chains." The West had tried to script his fall, but the world saw his rise. What was supposed to be a spectacle of submission became a prophecy of liberation. And as the days passed, the image of Ibrahim Traoré carrying that file began to live a life larger than politics. It was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about every African who had been told to wait, to beg, to kneel. It was about every small nation that had been told its voice did not matter. History is rarely written in speeches alone. It is written in symbols. And in that September moment, the symbol was clear. A young president refusing to confess, carrying instead the record of the world's crimes. The balance of power did not shift because he shouted louder. It shifted because he refused to kneel. From that day forward, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer seen merely as the president of Burkina Faso. He was a symbol of Africa's defiance, an icon of dignity, a reminder that even the smallest nation could stand against the mightiest powers. What began as a trap ended as a turning point. The so-called confession meant to humiliate Ibrahim Traoré had been folded, silenced, and transformed into something immortal. A living indictment of Western crimes, carried not in secret but in the open, for the world to see. And with that act, the young president crossed a threshold few ever reach. He ceased to be a politician and became a symbol. For Africa, the meaning was immediate and visceral. Here was a leader who had refused to beg, who had refused to cloak truth in the language of diplomacy. He had stood before the world's most powerful nations and spoken words many thought could never be spoken again. His defiance became not just his own, but the defiance of a continent long silenced. Markets buzzed with his name. University lectures debated his speech. In villages, elders nodded with pride as children repeated his words. But the resonance of the moment extended far beyond Africa. In Latin America, his call against debt echoed like thunder across nations that had felt the IMF's grip. In Asia, his rejection of foreign bases found sympathy among countries still shadowed by military presence. Even in Europe, among immigrant neighborhoods and marginalized voices, his defiance was celebrated as proof that truth can still pierce through marble walls. The phrase "union of black gold" grew beyond its original meaning. It no longer referred only to oil and minerals, but to the human wealth of Africa itself, the resilience, creativity, and spirit of its people. It became a banner under which millions rallied, a symbol that Africa's value could no longer be measured in barrels or tons, but in dignity and determination. Yet the lessons of Traoré's stand reached even further, cutting across borders and histories. The first lesson was about dignity. True dignity is not granted by titles or recognition from foreign powers. It is lived in the moment when one refuses to bow, even when every pressure demands submission. Dignity is not a gift, it is a choice. The second lesson was about memory. The world often urges the oppressed to forget, to erase the past for the sake of peace. But peace without truth is only silence, and silence is the ally of injustice. By naming slavery, colonization, genocide, and exploitation, Traoré reminded humanity that memory is not a burden. It is the foundation of justice. The third lesson was about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He stood alone against a hall filled with the most powerful nations on earth, armed not with armies, but with words. He had no guarantee that his defiance would change anything. Yet by speaking, he changed everything. And the final lesson was about identity. Traoré's words were not framed to seek applause from the West, but to affirm Africa's own pride. He showed that strength begins not in imitation, but in authenticity. That pride in one's heritage is not arrogance. It is survival. It is the root from which freedom grows. And then came the words that sealed the moment, words already etched into the hearts of millions. We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. From Ouagadougou to New York, from Dakar to Washington, those words traveled. They were spoken in marketplaces, whispered in classrooms, sung in churches, repeated in rallies. They became a mirror not only for Africa, but for the entire world, for nations under the shadow of domination, for communities struggling for recognition, for individuals facing their own chains, visible or invisible. Traoré's stand reminded humanity of a truth too often forgotten. Freedom is never given, it is seized. Justice does not wait for permission, it demands action. Dignity does not come from others, it comes from within. The world had sought to script his humiliation. Instead, it witnessed the birth of a symbol, not just for Africa, but for every people, every nation, every individual who dares to rise. And so the question lingers, not only in the halls of power, but in the hearts of all who heard his words. Will you wait for permission, or will you stand to claim what is right? And so, my brothers and sisters, the story did not end in New York. What was meant as a confession became an indictment. What was staged as humiliation became history. And what began as the voice of one young president became the roar of a continent. But this story is not only about Africa. It is about all of us. Because the lesson Ibrahim Traoré left behind is not trapped in the walls of the United Nations. It lives wherever human dignity is tested, wherever injustice wears the mask of power, wherever silence tempts us to bow instead of speak. We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. That was his challenge. Now it is ours. So I ask you, the listener, the witness of this moment, what will you do with this story? Will it fade like another headline, another fleeting controversy? Or will it remind you that truth matters more than convenience, that justice is worth more than comfort, and that freedom is not given but claimed? If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to you, then carry this story forward. Share it. Let it reach others who need to hear it. Leave a comment. What lesson strikes you most? Is it dignity, memory, courage, or identity? And most of all, do you believe the world is ready for an Africa that stands as equal? Subscribe if you believe truth must outlast propaganda. Stand with us as we stand with those who refuse to kneel. Because history is not written by the powerful alone. It is written by those who dare to speak when silence is demanded. God bless Africa. God bless every nation that rises. And may justice echo not just in marble halls, but in our hearts and in our actions.